Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to the show John Walters, the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer. We will be talking about midterms and campaign finance and polling. Are you excited, John?
Well, I am, but I choose to write about this stuff. Um, we are less than 1 month away from the Vermont primary, and there are some big races out there, particularly on the statewide ballot for the Democrats.
Hmm.
Some interesting primary races in the legislature as well, but I imagine that we will mostly talk about the statewide stuff on this podcast.
I think so. Yes, today. And I'm glad we're talking about it because I have already been getting calls from friends who are like, I have my early ballot, but I don't know who to vote for. And I'm telling them, you don't have to, just because you have your early ballot doesn't mean you have to vote right now. You can do more research. I'm hearing a lot of people really weighing and measuring Allie Richards and Amanda Janeau, who are running for the Democratic ticket for governor in the primary. Um, for you, you were looking at the statewide races for the campaign finance, digging through all the data at the Secretary of State's office. Um, Anything about their campaigns that piqued your interest as far as the money side of what's happening?
Well, for those just joining us, the July 1st was a big campaign finance deadline in Vermont, 6 weeks before primary day. The previous reports were due in mid-March, and like Allie Richards wasn't even running for governor at that point, at least
Right.
not officially. So, the campaigning and the fundraising really got serious after uh, the last report. So this is a big milestone for those who follow money in politics. And the top line story is that both Allie Richards and Amanda Janeau are doing respectably in terms of fundraising. Allie Richards raised like $366,000. Amanda Janeau was, I think, 270 something. And that's a lot more than any Democratic candidate has managed to raise at this point in the cycle, probably since 2016. The
Oh,
Democrats
wow.
had a series of grossly underfunded and under-resourced candidates for governor to go up against Phil Scott, and they have all failed,
Mhm.
um, understandably, because they didn't have the tools. So $366,000, $270,000 is not, that's not enough money to run a gubernatorial campaign, but it does show that they can raise money.
Hmm.
Allie Richards is deeply tied into the donor community from her years running Let's Grow Kids, the child care advocacy group. Amanda Janeau has a lot of connections, some in Vermont, some elsewhere, from her work as an economist and government consultant in America and around the world. So they are tapping into resources and they are spending at a pretty substantial rate too, because they're in a competitive primary and they both know that. So both of them would have a ton of work to do if they were going to be seriously competitive with Phil Scott, but they at least show that they might be able to do so.
Mm.
And you couldn't say that about Brenda Siegel or Christine Hallquist or Esther Charleston. You couldn't really even say it about David Zuckerman because
Hmm.
he raised a lot of money in small donations from progressive circles, but he was pretty much frozen out of the sort of like the mainstream Democratic donor class.
Okay.
He was too
Interesting.
progressive for their taste. And so, his ceiling was limited in terms of what he could raise. And both Richards and Janu have raised a lot more money than he managed to at the same point in his gubernatorial campaign. So it's a promising sign. The governor, by comparison, has done very little in terms of fundraising or spending because he rolled into this campaign cycle with a lot of money left over from 2024.
Hmm.
And although he has raised very little compared to the two Democrats, he actually has a lot more cash on hand because he has spent so little and they have been spending a lot because they're
Right.
in a competitive primary and he's not. Now, one little interesting footnote in the fact that the governor has spent very little is that in the spring of 2024, he spent a chunk of money on polling. And we can infer from the way the 2024 campaign played out that some of that polling was for him, but a lot of it was for the lieutenant governor's race and for legislative races.
Hmm.
And it was after that polling came in that a lot of big Republican donors were writing big checks to a lot of previously obscure Republican candidates for, especially for state senate and for lieutenant governor. And those campaigns got a huge money boost,
Hmm.
presumably because of Phil Scott's polling showing Democratic weakness. He didn't do any polling this spring, as far as we can tell. He would have had to disclose it if he had paid $50,000 for a big polling firm, and he didn't do that. And does that mean that he's really confident? Uh, does that mean that he realizes that in 26, unlike 24, the prevailing winds may be against the Republicans because of anti-Trump fervor? It may be a tacit acknowledgement that, there's not, this isn't going to be a great year for Vermont Republicans. I'm sure he still feels confident in his own ability to win, but there's no sign of the groundswell of big donor support that helped bring a lot of Republicans into the state house 2 years ago. John Rogers, the incumbent lieutenant governor, has raised very little money.
Hmm.
Most of the Republican state Senate candidates, including some of the incumbents, have raised very little money.
Hmm.
Um, and so now, the caveat to that is it was only at this time 2 years ago that the money flooded into all those campaigns.
Right.
And there's time for the donor class to get behind these people. But it's kind of to me, it's an interesting sign that Phil Scott didn't do any polling when he has the money to do it, and that at least so far, there's no sign of any particular generosity toward Republican candidates for the legislature or for lieutenant governor, even when they're incumbents. So
Hmm.
it makes me wonder, like for instance, do the Republicans realize that John Rogers is not viable?
Hmm.
I don't
Well,
know. That's a stretch. That's going
right.
out on a limb and it might break off under me.
Well, I guess part of the question I have too is yes, we're going into a primary, but a lot of races in Vermont traditionally in the primary are unopposed.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering too if that might be impacting some of these choices.
Well, clearly, I mean, the Democratic candidates for governor and lieutenant governor who are in competitive races, primary races, have an urgency to raise and spend money that their Republican counterparts don't have.
Hmm.
So it may be too soon to tell. I mean, Phil Scott could probably raise $1 million in a day if he put his mind to it. Um, and like I said, he already has enough money in the bank, right? More money in the bank right now than Richards and Janu combined.
Hmm.
So they have a ton of work to do, but there are green shoots showing
Hmm.
up, which is more than the Democrats had in the last few cycles.
Hmm. In your experience, John, as someone, who covers um, politics and campaign financing, you know, I was looking through some of the Secretary of State's website last night and this morning, and granted, I don't have the depth of experience that you have, so maybe some things just floated by. Um, and you and I both ran into some issues with the search function, but um, it feels to me that Vermont campaigns in general are not these really big financed, huge campaigns.
No, I mean
And
we're talking about a ridiculously low level of financing compared to, the flood of money that goes on constantly in Washington, D.C.
right,
We're talking about like a major donor kicks in $2,000 to a legislative campaign, and that's like almost enough money to run the entire campaign. And if you get a bunch of those donors jumping in, as they did 2 years ago for John Rogers and Republican Senate candidates, they have more money than they really know what to do with.
well,
Uh,
that was what my question to you was
so
gonna.
tens of
Oh,
thousands of dollars, which is sofa cushion change
mm-hmm.
for that candidate.
Well, and that was my question to you is where in Vermont campaigns do you see money actually making a difference?
Hmm. Well, you need to have a certain amount of money just to like get around the state and inspire the voters and buy yard signs and maybe buy some TV and radio airtime. That's not a big thing for legislative candidates, but it is for statewide candidates. It helps to be on TV. There are still a lot of voters and a lot of regular voters who, watch the local news and, even a lot of people who still listen to local radio. So the mass media buys can make a difference. You just need a certain amount of money at least to get your name out there,
Hmm.
to present the appearance of viability so that people don't bail on you like a lot of Democratic voters did for in the last few cycles.
Right.
So, but like, if a candidate for state senate, say, raises $50,000, which a bunch of them did 2 years ago, they don't really have anything to spend that money on. You can only buy so many yard signs and mailers. You buy
Yeah,
too
bumper
many,
stickers.
and voters, you get voter backlash from filling their mailboxes with junk. Um, so um, it's we're talking about, for a really competitive gubernatorial campaign, we're talking a couple $1 million, which again is chump change for other states and the national level. Um, but it does matter, and it is hard work for candidates to raise money, and they do work very hard at it, and I do not envy them that task.
Hmm.
So,
Um, looking at Phil Scott in his position as governor, and looking at Janu and Richards, who right now are probably his biggest competition that on the playing field, using all the sports metaphors that people hate. Um,
the prediction
are
market has pretty much taken Mike Pichak off the board.
Yeah, basically. Surprise, sorry, Mike, if you had other plans. Um, for I find this election interesting because in the past, when I've looked at folks who are running against Phil Scott, I really felt that one thing they were up against was name recognition. You know,
Yeah.
everyone knew who Phil Scott was, nobody knew who everyone else was. But I'm feeling with this election, it feels a little bit like what's at stake is not just name recognition, but people being afraid. Either afraid of more of what's happening in DC filtering into Vermont, or afraid that the hardships around raising higher taxes and economic issues and affordability, are not going to be dealt with. What's your sense on that?
And there's sort of a tide of fear and anger coming from some precincts in rural Vermont over stuff like, you know, uh, land regulation reform and, public education and property taxes. Um, there, there's a fair bit of anger among rural Vermonters, most of whom are conservative, but some of whom are liberal,
Hmm.
feeling that they are left out of the political process and left out of decision making in Montpelier. And a lot of that anger has been targeted on Democrats. From my perspective, I would say that Phil Scott doesn't represent the interests of rural Vermont any better than the Democrats do. He
Yeah.
wants to centralize a lot of stuff in ways that could be very harmful to rural interests. But that's a side issue. The fact is there is a lot of concern. There's a lot of fear. We haven't cracked open the recent poll yet. I'm sure we will.
Hmm.
From the University of New Hampshire Survey Center because Vermont doesn't have any pollsters anymore. Um, but it showed that there's a really significant decline in the number of respondents who thought that Vermont was on the right track.
Yeah. Yep, that
Five
stood out to
years
me
ago,
too.
5 years ago, at the height of COVID, after we'd been through a year plus of COVID, two-thirds of Vermonters thought the state was on the right track. And that's when we were all wearing masks and staying home. And now that figure is right around 50%. And
Hmm.
that's a big, gradual decline that adds up to a big and ominous trend. Now, you don't know why those voters are dissatisfied. It might be because their school is closing, or it might be because their hospital is cutting back, or it might be because of fears about Act 181, the land reform issue, affordability concerns, Trump. Dissatisfaction can take many forms in 2026, and you don't know exactly how that's going to play out. But there are a lot more unhappy people in Vermont concerning the state of our state and the state of our politics than there were even 5 years ago. Again, at the depth of the pandemic,
Hmm.
people were more optimistic than they are now, and that's saying a lot.
Well, and I think also in the pandemic, we saw our lawmakers taking action, and I think people felt much more or better taken care of, that the legislature was paying attention. And I feel from what I'm hearing on the street that a lot of people don't feel that way right now,
Yeah,
that they're kind of screaming into the void and the state house isn't responding.
yeah. Well, and one of the counterintuitive beliefs that I hold is that it's easy to govern during a crisis. It's harder to govern when times are okay or when you're sort of at a normal level of stress and anxiety and issues and challenges. Um, Peter Shumlin's best days as governor were after the flood, and
Good
he
point.
never recaptured that level of popularity or public acceptance, and his administration never functioned that well afterward. Governor Scott's best days as governor were during the pandemic. Um, and when he appeared daily on our TV screens and projected calm and reason and competence, people have not forgotten that. And a lot of people who normally vote Democrat vote for Phil Scott because of the pandemic,
Yeah.
because he projected such a strong and comforting and reasonable presence, especially compared to what was going on in Washington D.C. under Trump. Um, you know, that's a low bar to clear,
It's a
but
pretty low bar.
Scott cleared it comfortably. And the problem is that he benefited from that glow of competence and managerial, administrative, um, expertise during the pandemic. He then had the benefit of all the Biden era COVID relief money that flooded into Vermont. and made it possible for us to quickly overcome the economic problems caused by COVID and significantly advance a lot of needed policy initiatives like rural broadband
Hmm.
and electrification and even a fair bit of investment in housing, which has not turned around our housing crisis, but we did it.
Hmm.
Uh, Phil Scott had a lot of money to play with in like 2022 and 23 and 24. And that did a lot to keep his administration above water and make it look like things were going pretty well. And since that COVID pandemic era money ran out, he's had a tougher time making any progress on any of the issues that we face because he is unwilling to spend any more money. He's unwilling to raise taxes in any way at all. Um, and so a lot of our problems are sort of drifting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, a
And
lot of his
finally starting,
responses.
it's finally starting to show up in public views of his performance as governor,
Mhm.
according to that recent poll. So,
I want to ask you about that in a second, but yes, his response to a lot of issues has been, well, we just have to tighten our belts and stop spending, which in many cases is the right advice. But unfortunately, I think with Vermont, with our infrastructure, with a lot of the services people need, with our economy, with wages being what they are, people are already tightening their belts,
yeah.
and there's a point where you can't like cut your spending your way out of it anymore.
Well, there is a proposal that got a lot of traction in the legislature this year to institute a new wealth tax for
Mhm.
people who earned more than like mid to high six figures, um, who have benefited tremendously from Trump tax cuts for the wealthy in his first and second administrations. Um, and there was probably enough support in the Democratic caucuses to pass a wealth tax. Um, House and Senate leadership basically blocked it from happening.
Mhm.
And it was partly because, I mean, from their point of view, real politics, Phil Scott's going to veto this, so why bother?
Right.
Um, there is a strong political argument to be made that what we should be doing is putting down a marker in front of Phil Scott and forcing him to veto a wealth tax and explain himself to struggling people in Vermont. Um, the legislative leadership chose not to pursue that course.
Mhm.
Um, I think that was a political mistake, but I'm just a guy sitting on the sidelines and throwing jujubes or sitting in the balcony throwing jujubes, not somebody. I'm not in the arena, and it's a lot harder to be there than it is to be a blogger.
Mhm.
So, but that is a way. And Amanda Janeau, one of the two Democratic candidates for governor, is a strong proponent of the wealth tax idea.
Yeah.
Uh, and if she became governor, I think there would be a renewed push for that. The only real argument against it is the 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 idea that wealthy people would flee Vermont in droves if we passed a wealth tax. There is no statistical evidence to show that tax policy causes any kind of mass migration. Now, rich people tend to congregate in places like Florida and Texas, and like pro athletes will preferentially choose states with no income tax, um, you know, um, and all of that. But if you're already living in a place, just because your tax bill goes up by 1% or 2 isn't going to force you to pull up stakes and leave, at least not in significant numbers.
Mhm.
There is no evidence, for instance, that um, you know net migration back and forth between Vermont and New Hampshire, which has much lower taxes, is roughly balances out.
Hmm.
You know,
Okay.
both ways in roughly the same numbers. Uh, it's a popular idea, and Phil Scott talks about it all the time. but there is no evidence that it works that way in reality. Certainly not for like a surcharge on very wealthy people. Um, I think a lot of our wealthy people are not people who are earning money that is subject to the income tax anyway. Um, but maybe we should have a capital gain surcharge. But the fact is that we either, if we follow the Phil Scott path, what I fear is that we are in a slow downward spiral where things get worse. We can't afford to address them, so they continue to get worse, and the state becomes more unaffordable and more unlivable, and hospitals close and schools close. And what does that do to communities, especially in rural Vermont? And that's a much more powerful incentive to pick up and move than a wealth tax surcharge is.
Yeah.
So that's the idea, is that we can use this wealth tax to make beneficial changes that will actually make living better in Vermont and grow our economy if it's invested wisely. So
And
thus, thank you for attending my TED Talk.
well, and we need to hear from some underwriters, but I appreciate what you said, John, because I do feel so often right now where we are in Vermont, we're in this cycle of we need to address this issue, but we need money to address the issue. We don't have the money to. And so it's like that chicken and egg.
Yep.
And there's going to be a point where we can't pull ourselves out of that anymore. And you're right, we will lose the folks who can't afford the place, the middle class first, which most economists say is what you really need for
Yes.
a healthy economy. Um, Stay tuned, folks. John and I will be right back after this break. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW, LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I'm your host and producer, Olga Peters, and I am speaking with journalist John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. Before we dive back into our conversation, I want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of the show and sharing it with media centers around the state. And hey, John, what should we remind listeners of?
The views expressed by the host and guest, you and me, um, are our own, and none of the broadcast or distribution outlets who carry this program are responsible for anything we say.
Well done. Thank you, sir. So, John, before the break, we touched briefly on the polling numbers that just came out from the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. And but you had a lot more takeaways around Phil Scott and his approval rating, as well as the power of name recognition.
It
Let's talk
did.
about that a little bit.
Yeah, there are no polling outlets in Vermont. There are no media outlets in Vermont that seem to have the taste or resources to commission polls. So we got a poll from the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, which is a very widely respected polling organization. And it produced some interesting results. The top line, I suppose, is that Phil Scott's popularity seems to be crumbling. He is still liked more than not, but he used to like go back 4 or 5 years, and he basically had a 2-to-1 edge, favorable opinion versus unfavorable opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's 51% favorable and 43% unfavorable, with the
Mm,
rest undecided. So that's a significant drop. And it suggests that, his seemingly impervious Teflon coat has started to take on a few dents. And it suggests that there might be more room for a serious Democratic challenge than there has been since his first campaign for governor in 2016. Um, it showed that a significant drop in the number of Vermonters who think the state is going in the right direction. You go back 6 years, 5 years, Um, Poll taken at the height of the COVID pandemic in 2021. We'd been through this for a year and more.
Mhm.
Um, and we barely remember how bad those times were. Roughly almost a 2-to-1 edge in people who thought Vermont was going in the right direction. 49% versus like 27% who thought it was going in the wrong direction at the height of the pandemic. And now it's 49% who think we're going in the wrong direction and 33% who think we're going in the right direction. That's a complete turnaround.
Mhm.
And, that underscores the discontent that we feel in almost every part of the political spectrum in Vermont, from like real progressives who think that the Phil Scott is a dead weight and the Democrats are not doing enough, to centrists who are just unhappy about taxes and affordability and the seeming drift in state policy and public safety and all those things, to people on the right who feel completely shut out of the whole political process in Vermont because, frankly, they are. They're a marginal small group who cannot influence the course of anything in Vermont, which
Fair.
for some of us is a blessing. And for them, it's got to be really discouraging.
Mhm.
Um, so, we're in a place where Phil Scott's favorability is going down and has been going down consistently for a few years, and where more and more Vermonters are dissatisfied about the direction the state is going in, and much more dissatisfied now than they were when COVID was at its worst, which is I find remarkable. I almost can't repeat that often enough.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's and that shows also in the polling hypothetical matchups between Phil Scott and either Amanda Janoo or Allie Richards. Um, Phil Scott has substantial leads. It's like low 40s to mid to upper 20s for both of them. And that's a sizable lead. But, for Phil Scott to basically run against two people who are unknown among the electorate to a startling degree,
Right.
and for him to only get like 41, 42% support has got to be, an alarm bell going off in Team Scott headquarters. Um, he's still ahead. He's still the odds-on favorite to win, but it doesn't seem like as sure a thing as it did before I read this poll.
Mhm. Did the poll give you any sense of why his approval rating may be dropping? Is it that, the Republican Party maybe has shifted more to the right and away from him? Is it that, you know, the Dems are feeling this, X, Y, and Z? When we were talking off air, you made a very good point about independence in Vermont and how technically everyone in Vermont is an independent unless they declare.
Well,
So that's like a wider pool, I think, than we realize. Um,
yeah, it's a
so
more diverse. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, the numbers, which are pretty startling, when you break it down by party affiliation, most Democrats still say that part of the state is headed in the right direction. The vast majority of Republicans say that Vermont is in the wrong direction. Um, both numbers have declined.
Mhm.
Uh, Democrats 67% right direction in 2021, 52% now. Republicans 18% then, 10% now.
Mm.
Um, the big swing is among independents. 54% thought things were going well in 2021, again at the height of the pandemic, and only 16% think so now. We tend to think of independent voters as centrist voters, which is often true, but not in Vermont.
Mhm.
Technically, everybody's an independent. There is no official party affiliation. Bernie Sanders is an independent. Um, so, the independent ranks are large and diverse and difficult to categorize. But it is certainly fair to say that those who do not have a strong party affiliation have completely reversed their thought about how Vermont is doing. There's a huge amount of pessimism now, and there used to be a fair bit of optimism. And so those are presumably gettable voters, whether you are a Republican arguing for affordability and against taxes and against state regulation, or you're a Democrat who wants more action on things like healthcare and housing and shore up the public education system. So how those things sugar out. I think the thing that you can draw from that is there is a large appetite for and desire for change of some kind
Mm.
in the Vermont electorate.
Hmm.
And that is reflected somewhat in Phil Scott's declining numbers and in those right direction, wrong direction numbers. And in the fact that Phil Scott, in hypothetical matchups against two very little known Democratic challengers, can't muster anywhere close to a majority. Uh, so I think it's safe to say that things are volatile and that we don't really know how they might break. There might be a further Republican swing in our state legislature. Uh, there might also be a strong Democratic, counterswing to sort of counterbalance 2024, and it it seems likely to sweep Lieutenant Governor John Rogers out of office. He polls very poorly in this UNH survey. Um, so we don't know, but I think it's safe to say that a lot of people are unhappy. And a
Yeah.
lot more people are unhappy now than they were when they were having to wear masks and stay home all the time and have their kids doing remote learning, which is, again, a pretty stunning state of affairs.
Hmm. I want to just check in with you, John, because it seems that my knowledge needs a little help. You had mentioned that there's no polling organizations in Vermont. I thought UVM operated one. Please
They
correct
have
me.
not, they have not for a long time.
Okay,
There used to be one at Castleton State College.
that's right.
Before all the consolidation and cutbacks. But they closed their polling center several years ago now.
Okay.
So UNH still does one. It's a big business for them because New Hampshire is such a big political state,
Mhm.
and they have enough resources that they can dip into Vermont once in a while and do a poll. For a while after the Castleton polling operation closed up, I think that Vermont Public and VT Digger, or maybe 7 Days, sort of pooled their resources and commissioned a poll or two, but that hasn't happened in a while. So the UNH survey may be all we're going to get. And how accurate it is, I don't know. I heard one person say that based on what they looked at and the details, that it might skew a little bit left. But UNH is a very respected polling organization that, their credibility is at stake every time they put out a poll. So I would put at least some weight to it. And it's the only measure we've got.
Well, which we will touch base before the end of the show. We'll be talking about a conference you went to that might illuminate the whole conversation of there's not enough people with information right now. Um, Before we do that, though, I want to talk about Planet Hank, which is interesting because, Planet Hank is located down here in Windham County, his operation. And I think the conversation in Windham County around Planet Hank has mostly been around, is he a journalist? Is he not? Is he just an opinion piece? Some people love him, some people hate him. Um,
A
but
lot of
that's where
a
the
lot of
conversation has centered. But you've been watching his work and taking a very different perspective, and I think we should touch on that.
he is not to put too fine a point on it, a racist, misogynist sociopath. Um, he has made his bones off doing these sort of like live on the street true crime videos where he basically, shows people in dire straits being arrested or detained or fighting with police. For a while, he operated with the kind of tacit blessing of the Brattleboro Police Department. They have cut ties with him because some of the really, really outrageous and disgusting things he has said on his own social media platforms have come to light. Remarks about, you know, basically about, raping women, and, really, really severely toxic stuff like that. And, black people hate us. That's why we all have guns. He said that once.
Yeah.
Um, So, he has said a lot of vile things and published them himself, and he has issued the worst apology I have ever read for some of the stuff he has said and written. And that's saying a lot because, political figures are really bad at apologizing.
This is
Uh,
true.
he started out by saying, I apologize for anyone who is offended. And right there, it's not an apology because
Hmm.
you're putting the onus on the people who take offense
Right.
rather than on the fact that what you said was inherently offensive.
Hmm.
But then he went on to blow it out of the water by saying, I apologize for anything I've ever said or done that might have offended anybody anywhere. So he basically made fun of his own apology.
Right.
Now, this guy, the reason I pay attention to him is, he is taken seriously in Brattleboro. Every time I write about him, I get a couple of comments from people in Brattleboro who are concerned enough about the public safety situation in the town that their view of Planet Hank is, well, he's kind of a jerk, but he has some good points.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a far too generous interpretation of what he's doing. Um, but that's the situation in Brattleboro, and I can
Yeah.
understand why people feel that way. People feel that way often in Montpelier and Barre, and certainly in Burlington, and anywhere else in Vermont where the problems of substance use or homelessness or name housing shortages cause people to be in dire situations. Um, the thing that really makes me try to pay attention to Planet Hank, even though I hate it, is that he's becoming a significant figure in Republican politics. He is,
Mm-hmm.
according to published accounts, the chair of the Windham County Republican Committee. Now that's one of 14 county chairs for the Republican Party. That's a significant party post. He has been creating AI generated videos, smear videos about Congresswoman Becca Ballant that have been deployed very happily by the campaign of Mark Kerster, who is running as a Republican for Congress. Um, Hank has spoken at a significant Republican event in central Vermont. Um, he where he shared the stage with a state representative. Um, he is the kind of person, willful, energetic, talented. Inarguably, he has great talent for social media, and sociopathic, who can really move up the ladder quickly during the Trump era of republicanism. And I could very easily see him becoming an influential figure in statewide Republican circles. There are a lot of local and county committees that are basically closer aligned with Hank than they are with Phil Scott.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I see him as someone who may be on the rise and who has the potential to become our very own Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert or, choose your willfully extremist Republican. Um, I don't know that he will ever run for office, but, in terms of like being a behind the scenes power, in terms of potentially wielding influence at the state level of the Republican Party,
Which part of their job is to recruit other candidates?
Yeah, and to be honest, the local media in Brattleboro is not covering him well.
Hmm.
The Reformer seems to be sort of tacitly pro Hank. The Commons has basically ignored him.
Hmm.
Um, VT Digger has a reporter in Southeast Vermont, but he rarely covers hard news. He mostly writes feature stories. There's been little statewide media attention on Hank. And I think he's just such a patently outrageous and unacceptable figure in what Phil Scott claims to be a uniquely polite and civil political discourse in Vermont that, I feel the need to shine a spotlight on him occasionally because I think he's potentially a danger.
Hmm.
He pushes Vermont politics in that Trumpy direction, which he's capable of doing, then I think Vermont politics will be worse for it.
Yeah, I think what stands out for me with your coverage of Planet Hank is, we've held this long story about the Republican Party in Vermont, the party of George Aiken, um, and these real stalwart,
Yep.
caring Republicans
Uh,
who,
Dick
yep,
Snell,
step.
who raised taxes during a recession. Jim Douglas, even to an extent, he's more
Mhm.
conservative than his reputation, but he wasn't by modern standards. He's an absolutely reasonable guy. Um, Jim Jeffords, before he got sick of the Republicans Act.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's the tradition of Vermont republicanism
And
that used to be going away and may disappear entirely after Phil Scott.
right. And that's what stands out to me about your coverage with looking at Planet Hank and some of the other big players in the Republican Party, because it does seem like that is no longer a story we can tell about the Republican Party um, anymore. Um, just in the interest of time, a little whiplash here. I'd love to hear about the conference you went to in Pennsylvania that was looking at, I believe, nonprofit journalism.
Yeah. Nonprofit journalism is a growing sector that's hoping to supplant the failing for-profit model that journalism, operated under for decades and decades in America.
Hmm.
Back when like newspapers could sell reams of advertising and, basically subscribers and newsstand purchases accounted for it's like 1/4 of their revenue.
Yeah.
Advertising was the rest. Those days are gone. They're never coming back. It's almost impossible to run a for-profit paper unless you turn it into a zombie paper like the Burlington Free Press.
Hmm.
With rare exception, the Boston Globe is doing well, the New York Times is doing well, but um, you know, generally the for-profit sector is continuing to decline.
Especially at
Nonprofit,
the local level, right?
yeah, a lot of local papers have become zombie papers. We
Mm.
are relatively fortunate in Vermont in that we have a lot of newspapers that are still locally owned, locally controlled. Some of them are for profit, some of them are nonprofit, some of them have converted from for profit to nonprofit. And so I'm on the board of the Hardwick Gazette, which is a traditionally for profit, locally owned paper that became a nonprofit a couple of years ago. And we're trying to reinvent ourselves as a nonprofit, community supported publication, more like a public radio or TV station than like a traditional newspaper,
Mm.
because it will require significant reader support. It will require readers to make the same decision about the newspaper they read or the online source they depend on as they have about their public radio or public TV station, which is this is something that deserves my support.
Hmm.
And so I will have a news budget in my household budget where I will maybe support a national publication or an international publication like the New York Times or the Guardian, and maybe I will support a statewide organization like Vermont Public or VT Digger, and then I will also support my local enterprise, whether that's the Commons in Brattleboro or the Chester Telegraph or the Hardwick Gazette or the Bridge in Montpelier, or 7 Days, which is still for profit, but it is now a reader supported for profit. There are many other local newspapers and news organizations like that. This conference was put together by the Institute for Nonprofit News, which is trying to foster and develop nonprofit journalism. And a lot of their focus is on the sort of like business and fundraising side because there are a lot of talented journalists and not nearly as many who are good at, keeping the doors open and the lights on.
Very different skill sets.
Traditional journalists would say we shouldn't have anything to do with money.
Yeah.
And the problem is in the modern era with nonprofit journalism, you kind of have to position yourself slightly differently so that your news organization is a community resource. It's not just a newspaper, it's a community resource like a library or a park or a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the fabric of a community. And a lot of the value of a local newspaper is not like covering the select board, it's covering high school sports and arts and entertainment and, businesses and, you know, interesting local people. It's creating that sense of community.
Yeah.
And that's what we're
Good
trying
point.
to do with the Gazette. That's what the Commons is trying to do. That's what all these papers are trying to do in various ways. Um, the conference was really inspiring in a lot of ways and challenging in many others. There's a lot of work to do. Success is far from certain. Um, but there are a lot of talented, dedicated people in everywhere across the country who are really trying their best to make this happen and to create a future where nonprofit journalism is a significant part, maybe even the biggest part of the news landscape. And if we can make it to that point, and I went to the same conference 1 year ago, and I saw big changes and big developments just in the course of a year in the maturation of this field.
Hmm.
And, the management strategies and the resources and the development of skills and techniques and the availability of advice and coaching. Our editor at the Hardwick Gazette is in a 1 year coaching program with another nonprofit news organization called Lion, Lion.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there's a lot good going on. It is still not enough to counterbalance the continuing decline in for-profit journalism. Net journalism jobs declined last year over the previous year. So we're still not out of the woods, but there are really strong reasons to be optimistic about the future. It's going to take a lot of people putting their shoulders to the wheel and intelligently so. It's
Mm.
not enough to put out a good product. It's not enough to cover your local community. You've got to connect with your local community and hold public events and be out there, you know, amongst the people and create relationships with major donors, as uncomfortable as that may make you feel as a journalist, because the major donors are got to be part of this and they got to feel like they're part of the operation as long as they understand that they can't buy positive coverage. And
Right.
fortunately, most of our donor community in Vermont understand that. We have never had anyone we have gotten pretty substantial 5-figure gifts from people. Um, and never has any one of them said, well, maybe you shouldn't cover this, or maybe, could you write a nice story about this, or whatever. And so, there are reasons to be optimistic about this. A lot of our news organizations are in a better position, far better position than they were even a year ago. But again, we're not out of the woods yet. And I would encourage people to support their local news enterprise. It is just as worthy. They may not publish Wordle every day, but they're just as worthy as the New York Times. And they are more vital for your community because nobody else is going to cover that news.
Yeah.
And the other somewhat related pitch I will throw in here, since you mentioned community access TV earlier on. Community access TV is a great resource.
Hmm.
is kind of underdeveloped in a lot of ways, and they are facing financial challenges because of the decline in cable revenue.
Right.
But they do a lot of stuff. There are at every one of the local community access TV stations around Vermont, there are people who are doing interesting, creative stuff.
Yep.
And some of them are doing stuff that's really valuable for the public discourse. And if you want to know more about legislative candidates or statewide candidates, community access is one of your best sources for information because they will broadcast either live or tape, uh, candidate forums where you get to see these candidates in action, taking questions and interacting with each other, and you get a much better sense of who they are than from their, cookie cutter, anodyne, you know,
Hmm.
any vestige of loose ends or, you know, they they never candidate websites never mention their party affiliation.
Right.
They never even mention where they're running.
Yeah.
They don't say I'm the candidate for, Senate in Windham County. They say I'm running for Senate
Yep.
for Vermont. So the community access TV stations are a great resource for people who want to dig in and know more about who they're voting for in the primary or in the general election. So
Hmm.
that's another plug for nonprofit media in Vermont.
Thank you, John. Unfortunately, we are out of time on the Montpelier Happy Hour, but I want to thank John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer for joining us today. John, if people want more of your work, where can they find it?
Also a nonprofit enterprise.
Maybe not by design, but by reality.
Take donations, but I don't push it. So it's a small passive income stream, but it's the Vermont Political Observer, which is the VPO.org. And if do Google search or DuckDuckGo search for the VPO, you'll find me and the Vienna Philharmonic, and it's easy to tell us apart.
And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW every Friday at 2 p.m., rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings. And wherever you find your podcasts, if you ever want to reach out to me, you can drop me an email at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. Everybody, have a good weekend.